There have been some crazy elections throughout Canadian history, but none represented as big a shift in power as did the 1993 federal election. This competition saw the largest decline in the history of a Canadian political party. How did the Progressive Conservatives go from 169 seats in the 1988 election to a pitiful 2 seats in the 1993 election, losing official party status and ultimately causing the collapse of the Progressive Conservative Party? And how did 2 new political parties win dozens of seats, occupying the 2nd and 3rd place? From controversial attack ads to fiery debates, this is the story of the 1993 Canadian federal election. Unlike America, there are no time limits for Canadian prime ministers, so Brian Mulroney, first elected in 1984, could have run for a 3rd term. But after 10 long years in office, he became plagued by controversies that would tarnish the party's reputation in an irreparable way. When Mulroney first ran in 1984, his landslide victory was only possible because of a coalition of support coming from the typical fiscal conservatives who wanted small government and low taxes, with social conservatives that were popular in Western Canada and Quebec nationalists from Mulroney's home province. This coalition led Mulroney to win a majority of seats in every single province across the country, but the coalition was precarious. Mulroney's introduction of the Goods and Services Tax, or GST, in 1990 was extremely controversial. Mulroney championed it as replacing a hidden 13.5% manufacturer's sales tax. But the Canadian economy was in a recession around this time, with GDP growing just 0.16% in 1990 and contracting negative 2.09% for 1991. On top of this, Mulroney faced significant opposition in the Senate.
It was in front of a cheering crowd of local Tories that the Prime Minister announced that he won't put up any longer with the Liberal senators' bid to kill the GST.
The will of the accountable House of Commons must be supreme to the will of the appointed Senate.
Canada's Senate members are appointed by prime ministers, and since 1965, they need only retire at the age of 75, which meant that Mulroney's only method to get the GST through the Senate was to expand its seats. So, Mulroney enacted a never-before-used section of the Senate that would allow him to add 8 seats to the Senate, allowing him to appoint conservatives to the Senate, giving himself a majority. Critics call this an arcane provision because it relied on the 1867 British North America Act, which had a provision that allowed the Queen the power to break deadlocks between the houses by appointing senators.
It actually is. Under the Constitution of Canada, there's a never-used provision, it's never been used before, which allows the Queen, and by the way, the request here has to go directly to the Queen, to create either 4 or 8 new Senate places.
Meanwhile, Mulroney supporting Quebec was also turning on him. In 1987, he proposed the Meech Lake Accord in an attempt to appease voters in the French province. The provincial premiers would meet in Meech Lake, Quebec, and negotiate a series of proposed amendments to the Canadian Constitution. This included recognizing Quebec as a distinctive society, giving provinces more power on immigration, allowing Supreme Court justices and senators' names to be drawn from province-provided names, and more. However, it ultimately failed, facing criticism from the lack of public consultation, as well as a famous open letter in the Toronto Star by former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, who said it would be the end of the dream of one Canada. The Meech Lake Accord also prompted the creation of a brand new political party, Bloc Québécois. The brand new party was led by one of Mulroney's own cabinet members, Lucien Bouchard. The Quebec Lawyers' Party would advocate for Quebec sovereignty and for Quebec to secede from Canada. In 1992, just a year before the 1993 election, Mulroney tried again with the Charlottetown Accord, which would recognize Quebec as a distinct society. It would also address issues of Indigenous self-government, give more powers from the federal government to the provinces, enact reforms to the House of Commons, Senate, and more. The accord was accepted by all 10 provinces and then sent to the public to decide via referendum. Most provinces, including Quebec, voted against the referendum, with the motion having roughly 45% for and 55% against. The failure of the Meech Lake Accord and now the Charlottetown Accord was the nail in the coffin for Mulroney's Quebec support. In the West, Mulroney was facing another new competitor. In October of 1987, Preston Manning founded the Reform Party, a conservative populist party with support mainly in Alberta. In 1989, Reform Party won its first seat through a by-election in Beaver River, a rural riding in Alberta. The candidate, Deborah Gray, was immediately named Preston's new deputy leader.
Mr. Speaker, as a new member speaking for the first time in the House of Commons, I wish to congratulate and thank those who make this institution what it is.
The new party challenges conservatives from the right, advocating for a Western version of the Quebec nationalism seen on the other side of the country. In the wake of these devastating losses from all sides of his coalition, Mulroney formally resigned in June of 1993, just a few months before Canadians were set to vote in October.
Earlier today, I advised my party and caucus that I would be resigning as party leader and prime minister soon after the party had chosen a successor.
Since the Progressive Conservatives remained in charge, it was now time to pick a new prime minister who would lead them to a victory in the 1993 election. The clear frontrunner was Kim Campbell, who was MP for Vancouver Centre, as well as a respected lawyer. Almost no competitors decided to face off against Kim, though Jean Cheris did run after being convinced by Mulroney. Cheris became the major competitor, acting as a successor to Mulroney's policies, whereas Kim Campbell was seen as giving the party a new direction. What was initially thought to be a blowout victory turned into an incredibly tight race, with Kim Campbell ultimately winning with 52.7% to Jean Cheris' 47.3%.
Candidate everyone has been talking about said the words everyone has been waiting to hear today. Kim Campbell is going after the leadership of the Conservative Party.
This made Kim Campbell the first female prime minister in Canadian history, with a still remaining 132 days in office. The Progressive Conservatives now had their leader, and were prepared to go into the 1993 election with a new face. The Liberal Party of Canada under John Turner had won the second most seats in the 1988 election, and therefore formed the official opposition against Mulroney. However, Turney's Liberals supported the Meech Lake Accord, resulting in disagreements among party members. Most notably was Jean Chrétien, a Quebec MP who faced off against Turner in the last leadership election, losing to him by roughly 15% of the vote. Chrétien resigned his seat in 1986, saying that he was retiring for politics. But he also delivered contradictory remarks, telling reporters within days of his retirement that he loves politics and will always be a politician. Moreover, Chrétien never disbanded the campaign organization that he formed in 1984, all of which indicated that this retirement may not last long. When John Turner resigned in 1990, Chrétien announced his intention to run for leader of the Liberals. His main opposition for the role was Paul Martin and Sheila Copps, neither of which came close to Chrétien's 56.8% of the vote. As the forerunner in the prior election, Chrétien won the leadership by a landslide. The fifth major party running in the 1993 election was the NDP, or New Democratic Party, a left-wing, social democratic party that typically finds support with organized labor. The NDP also ran a woman as their leader, as Ed Broadbent was replaced by the Yukon leader, Audrey McLaughlin. The NDP was incredibly popular during Mulroney's decline, polling above the Liberals in 1991. However, their support was seeing a slow and gradual decline leading into the election. On September 8, 1993, the election was called by Prime Minister Kim Campbell to be held on October 25th. While Campbell started her campaign with strong support, her polls would start tanking rapidly throughout the course of the election. After 10 years of Mulroney's governance, it was hard to shake her party's baggage. In 1993, Canada had a staggering 11.4% unemployment as a consequence of the ongoing economic recession that Mulroney presided over. On the first day of her campaign, Campbell made remarks to reporters that haunted her throughout the campaign.
I think realistically, all developed industrialized countries are expecting what I would consider to be an unacceptable level of unemployment for the next 2, 3, or 4 years.
And she refused to set targets for job creation.
I mean, I can say, how many jobs I'd like to create. But I'm sorry, that's old politics.
This frank honesty and bluntness was something that many supported her for. And in retrospect, her economic predictions were correct. But promising results 4 years from now was not a motivating message to start out the campaign, and her remarks of unemployment were not popular with so many people out of work. Prime Minister Campbell faced another major setback after her party aired this now infamous attack ad against Jean Créatin.
Mr. Prime Minister, does he understand that his plan to allow a deficit each year would increase our debt? How can he believe that you can kickstart a modern economy by fixing some roads? Why doesn't he answer the questions he's asked? Doesn't he understand the questions? Or the answers? Or both? Jean Chrétien, a prime minister?
These negative ads were seen as mocking Créatin's disability, as well as his physical appearance. Moreover, there was no mention of the Progressive Conservatives' own policies or leader's name. Créatin was quick to pounce back, blasting these ads as being overly negative and lacking a positive vision.
They tried to make fun of the way I look. God gave me a physical defect. And I've accepted that since I'm a kid. It's true that I speak on one side of my mouth. I'm not a Tory, I don't speak on both sides of my mouth.
In response, Campbell had the other attack ads they made removed and decided not to air the 2 other ads they produced. Kim Campbell was becoming more and more unpopular by the day, and this was made worse by her associations with Mulroney. The number one issue that kept recurring in this election was the economy. And as a champion of her party's GST tax, with a skyrocketing federal deficit, Kim Campbell was taking on all of the blame as Prime Minister. In September, the Liberals released their platform, which came to be called the Red Book. What was noteworthy about this platform was the length, at 112 pages long. Several years of planning went into this platform, which was a major innovation to Canadian campaigning. The book had chapters on every major issue pertaining to the election. It was filled with graphics, charts, and other designs, and widely distributed, printing thousands of copies. By contrast, the NDP's 1993's platform was much smaller and did not delve into issues in the book-style format that Créatin's Red Book did. A few days later, the Progressive Conservatives quickly put out their own document, which also lacked detail and provided vague and unclear answers when compared to Créatin's thorough preparation. The first time these 5 competitors squared off together was at the federal debates, when the party bosses made known what people were not happy with the Progressive Conservatives. Listen to Preston Manning's opening remarks.
The first leader to give an opening statement will be Preston Manning, the leader of the Reform Party. Mr. Manning.
Well, thank you, Anne, and thanks to you for joining us for this leaders' debate tonight. These debates are the first time that the leaders of the traditional parties have been confronted on a national stage by political newcomers.
The North American Free Trade Agreement was debated heavily in the prior 1988 election, which was criticized by the NDP as losing Canadian jobs to America.
Say that you want to put people back to work, but what in fact your jobs plan does is keep in place the trade deals, the Canada-US trade deal, and proceeding with NAFTA, which we know since 1988 has helped to put 250 Canadians out of work a day. How can you say you have a jobs plan that will create work on the one hand and refuse when you had the chance in the House of Commons, I might add, to defeat NAFTA? Your party stayed home. You didn't defeat NAFTA. You had a chance to do it, and then you stood with your big company friends and not with the unemployed worker in Windsor.
However, 4 years later, when it was actually being implemented, much of the country was over the debate and didn't view it as central to the campaign.
We get in the House of Commons where the NDP and the Liberals try to outdo themselves in their support of trade. And yes, we want to have trade. And yes, we want to trade with underdeveloped countries. But every time we have an agreement that will in fact secure Canadian access to markets, they're against it. They want trade, but not with anybody in particular.
Also at contention was the issue of the budget, with each party proposing their own ideas to lower the budget.
We don't have to touch that. I've set out exactly where I'm going to cut it. More cuts to the cost of government, more cuts to the Department of Defense, more cuts to subsidies to business. I've laid out a very clear Mr. Plan, Mr. Chrétien. You don't have a plan. You don't even recognize that there's a problem.
Mr. Manning, you have
Can I ask you a question?
While the Bloc Québécois engaged with a wide variety of topics throughout this election, the main concern for Bouchard was Quebec's autonomy.
Quebecers have a conflicting and as legitimate as their own vision of their own country. So we need an additional country in the land. That's why there is a sovereignist movement in Quebec. That's why there will be a bloc in the House, I hope, because the bloc will reflect a very important element of the political landscape of Quebec.
If you could...
With 2 failed constitutional amendments, it wasn't surprising that debates around constitutional reforms dominated the political environment, and many became uninterested in the topic. Liberal Party leader Jean Chrétien assured voters that he wouldn't open the Constitution for these reasons.
I've traveled in Quebec and they tell me, stop talking Constitution. I was in Gaspé and they told me, Mr. Chrétien, if you promise to us that when you will be Prime Minister, you will never talk Constitution, you will die, Prime Minister, they said to me. So the people want us to talk about jobs. They want us to talk about, a good society where we can be, have integrity, compassion, sharing. These are the values that the Francophones share with the Anglophone Canadians.
On the other hand, the Bloc was positioned as the ones who did care about the Constitution, placing themselves at the opportune moment to generate support from Quebec sovereigntists.
You just say it's a constitution, it doesn't mean anything. Constitution is the way decisions are being made. It is the relationship between the states, between the citizens and the state. It's so important. It is the basis of everything. You will never achieve anything to settle the economic problem if you don't do something to streamline your decision-making structure.
As the elections drew nearer, the Liberals overtook the Conservatives, with Campbell's popularity declining more and more each day. This can be seen in opinion polls, where Liberals and Conservatives had similar support in August. In the next few months, their numbers would fall off a cliff, with the Bloc and Reform Party getting most of their support. Many of the Western Conservatives started supporting Manning's new Reform Party, with Alberta and British Columbia leaning to the Reform side. This split the right wing between these 2 factions. Meanwhile, the PCs lost almost all the support they used to have in Quebec over their failed constitutional reforms, and it was looking like the Bloc would sweep Quebec. While many would expect the NDP to perform well as a pro-worker, left-wing party during a major economic recession, their popularity nonetheless declined further and further throughout the campaign. Come election day, the writing was on the wall, with the Liberals getting an early lead in seats, and the Bloc in close second place.
They can get up over 30% and pick up more than the 11 seats they had last time.
But it really raises some questions for the future of the Tories, because if the Bloc really is at 50 or 53% of in its share of the vote, and the Liberals are moving up, that leaves no room for Conservatives. And some people were talking on the eve of the election about there only being 2 Conservative survivors in the province of Quebec.
As the night progressed further, it was evident that the PCs were going to lose even worse than anyone could have expected. The Progressive Conservatives were leading in a few tight races, and were looking at the possible of potentially winning around 6 seats.
Just look at it. These are the numbers collected so far. 187 of the 295 ridings reported 140 Liberals leading or elected tonight already. They only need 148 for a majority government. We are sure they're going to do it, perhaps even in Manitoba.
Just hours later, it was confirmed, though no one was surprised. The Creatin would form a majority government, with broadcasters referring to the election as a Liberal wave.
I'm Peter Mansbridge. Let's recap where we are tonight. Smack dab in a nation that's turned Liberal red. It is a stunning majority for Jean Chrétien, a mind-numbing defeat for the Tories, and a possibility, still very real at this hour now, that the Bloc Québécois could form the official opposition.
Shockingly, the other thing that was in question now was whether the official opposition, conferred upon the second-place party, would be won by the Reform Party or the Bloc Québécois.
You could count Tory seats on your fingers, and the Bloc Québécois could yet become the official opposition. So too, though, could Reform. Look at those swashes of red, up north, through the west, all through Ontario, mostly through Atlantic Canada. Overall numbers, look at that. Liberals leading or elected tonight, and most of them are elected now, in 170 seats.
This race for second between the two regional parties was incredibly close, with seats tied at 50 to 53 towards the end of the ballot counting. However, by the end of the night, the Bloc came away slightly ahead, clinching 54 seats to the Reform's 52 seats. Lucien Bouchard had done the unthinkable. He led a new party to leader of the official opposition in just one election, while only running candidates in a single province. Nonetheless, the election was an astonishing success for Manning as well, who couldn't have dreamed his new party would do so well.
Well, I want to thank you, and I want to congratulate you all on the breakthrough for reform which has been achieved this evening. Thank you.
Meanwhile, the NDP were down bad. With 44 seats won in the 1988 election, Audrey McLaughlin led her party to a meager 9 seats, winning less than 1 million votes and only 6.88% of the popular vote. The Progressives Conservatives fared even worse. In what is the biggest downfall in Canadian political history, the PCs went from 211 seats in 1984 to 169 seats in 1988, to just 2 seats in 1993. No one could have imagined such a devastating defeat. The grand coalition Mulroney had formed a decade ago was now dead. Kim Campbell lost her own seat in Vancouver to a rookie Liberal. With the only two Conservatives to win being Jean Charest, Campbell's opponent in the leadership campaign, and Elsie Wayne, a popular mayor from St. John. In a shock to many, the two-term Progressive Conservatives MP, Gilles Bernier, who was barred by Kim Campbell to run due to fraud charges, won a seat as an independent in Quebec, beating out the new Progressive Conservative leader, as well as the Bloc. Despite these devastating seat losses, Kim Campbell did win a fair amount of the popular vote, yet won few seats because of how geographically spread out the votes were. If we look at the electoral map, we can see how the Reform Party took a majority in Alberta and BC. Reform also won 2 seats in Saskatchewan, 1 seat in Manitoba, and a seat in Ontario. By contrast, the Bloc Québécois absolutely dominated in Quebec, winning 54 seats to the Liberals' 19 seats. The NDP leader Audrey McLaughlin did win her seat in Yukon, marking one small victory for the NDP. The NDP also came out strong in Saskatchewan, winning 5 seats, a tie with the Liberals. However, the remainder of the provinces were won nearly uncontested by Jean Chrétien, with a staggering 98-seat blowout in Ontario, winning every seat except for 1. The Liberals also won seats in every other province, except for Yukon. Creatin did particularly well in Atlantic Canada, where every seat was won by Liberals. Kim Campbell resigned from her position as the leader of the Conservative Party in December 1993, and Jean Charest became the new party boss, though the party was now a fraction of its former glory. Now Jean Chrétien, the new Prime Minister of Canada, would have a full majority government until the next election, making one of the most exciting and consequential elections in the history of Canada. If you enjoyed this election coverage, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and drop a comment, and click the video on the screen for more videos where we explain elections.